Title: The Watcher in the Storm. The summer thunderstorm rolled in faster than expected. Dark, swollen clouds gathered over the small town of Willow Creek, turning the late afternoon into twilight. A loud clap of thunder echoed across the sky, and the first heavy drops of rain splattered against windows and rooftops. Inside her cozy cottage, Claire felt a shiver run down her spine. She'd always hated storms, ever since she was a little girl. The wind howled like a wild animal, and she could hear branches scraping against the walls like fingers clawing to get in. Claire glanced at the old grandfather clock in the corner. It was nearly 6 p.m. She sighed and decided to call it an early night. As she headed toward the kitchen to fix herself a cup of tea, a bright flash of lightning illuminated the room, revealing the darkened shape of a man standing in the yard outside her window. She gasped, dropping the kettle. It clattered noisily on the floor. Heart racing, she peered out into the rain-splattered glass, but there was no one there, just the swaying trees and the rain coming down in sheets. The wind seemed to grow louder, rattling the windows with each gust. She couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. A sense of unease settled deep in her chest, gnawing at her nerves. The kettle began to whistle, and Claire jumped. She grabbed it quickly, spilling some hot water on her hand. Wincing, she poured the tea and carried it back to the living room. As she sat down, another bolt of lightning cracked across the sky, and for a brief second, she saw him again, the figure standing by the old oak tree outside. This time, he was closer. Claire's breath caught in her throat. She set the cup down, her hands trembling. She stared at the spot where the man had been, but once again, he was gone. The rain was now pouring down in torrents, making it nearly impossible to see anything outside. She told herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her, but a cold sweat had broken out on her forehead. She decided to call her friend, Emily, who lived just a few blocks away. Maybe Emily could come over and they could wait out the storm together. Claire picked up her phone and dialed Emily's number. It rang and rang, but no one answered. She tried again, but the call went straight to voicemail this time. Great, Claire muttered under her breath. She set the phone down and tried to focus on the television, flipping through channels, hoping to distract herself. But every now and then, she'd glance back toward the window, half expecting to see the figure standing there again. Minutes passed, and the storm raged on. The power flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. The room was plunged into darkness. Claire cursed under her breath and reached for the flashlight she kept on the coffee table. She flicked it on, and the beam of light cut through the dark, casting eerie shadows on the walls. She decided to check the back door, just to be safe. The old wooden floors creaked beneath her feet as she made her way down the hallway. She reached the kitchen and aimed the flashlight toward the door. The latch was still in place. She sighed in relief, but turned around to check the front door next. The moment she stepped into the living room, a loud knock echoed through the cottage. Claire froze. The knock came again, louder this time, urgent. She shined the flashlight toward the door, heart thudding in her chest. "Who is it?" she called out, trying to keep her voice steady. No answer. Another knock, harder, more insistent. She swallowed hard, her mouth suddenly dry. "Who's there?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. Then a voice, low and gravelly, came from the other side of the door. "I need help. Please, let me in." Every instinct in her body screamed to keep the door shut, but the voice sounded desperate. She moved closer, her hand hovering over the latch. "Who are you?" she asked. There was a long pause, then the voice replied, "My car broke down. I'm just trying to get out of the storm." Claire hesitated. The rain was still pounding against the windows, and the wind howled like a living thing. She couldn't just leave someone out there, could she? But something felt wrong. Very wrong. "I'm sorry, but I can't let you in," she said finally. Silence followed. The knocking stopped. Claire waited, her breath coming in short, quick bursts. After a few moments, she dared to peer through the peephole. The porch was empty. Whoever had been knocking was gone. A wave of relief washed over her, but it was short-lived. Suddenly, a loud crash came from the back of the house. Claire spun around, shining her flashlight down the hallway. Her heart pounded in her ears as she slowly walked toward the sound. The kitchen door was wide open, swinging on its hinges. Claire's mind raced. She knew she had locked that door. She stepped back, fear coursing through her veins. Just as she turned to run, she felt a cold hand grip her shoulder from behind. She screamed, spinning around, but there was no one there. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang. Panicked, she bolted for the front door, throwing it open and running out into the storm. The rain soaked her instantly, blinding her as she sprinted across the yard. She glanced back at the cottage, and through the window she saw him, the dark figure standing inside her living room, staring back at her. With a terrified sob, she kept running, not stopping until she reached Emily's house. She pounded on the door, and finally, Emily opened it, her face etched with concern. "Claire, what happened? You look like you've seen a ghost," Emily exclaimed. Claire quickly explained what she had seen, her words tumbling over each other in her panic. Emily's face grew serious. "Claire," she said slowly, "no one has lived in that cottage for over a decade. It's been abandoned since the old owner disappeared during a storm just like this." Claire stared at her friend in disbelief. "No, that's impossible. I've been living there for weeks." Emily shook her head. "That place has been empty for years. I don't know who you've been talking to, but it wasn't me." Claire's blood ran cold as she realized she had been living in a house where no one was supposed to live, and something or someone had known she was there all along. Title: Echoes of the Storm. The storm came in like a freight train, roaring and smashing into the small house nestled on the edge of the forest. Eliza had been alone all day, her husband Jack having left for a work trip early that morning. The sky had darkened by noon, and the wind had picked up in intensity, making the old house groan under the pressure. Eliza stared out the window as the first flashes of lightning split the sky, followed by rolling thunder that rattled the window panes. The rain came down in sheets, obscuring the view of the forest beyond. She wrapped her cardigan tighter around her and went to make a cup of tea to calm her nerves. As she waited for the kettle to boil, the power flickered and went out. The house was swallowed by darkness, save for the occasional flash of lightning that illuminated the rooms in stark, eerie contrasts. Eliza grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and tried to find her phone to call Jack. It was then she noticed something unsettling. Her phone was missing. Eliza searched frantically through the drawers and on countertops, but it was nowhere to be found. The only sound was the relentless storm outside and the eerie creaking of the old house. She grabbed a lantern from the hall closet, turned it on, and headed into the living room. The wind howled louder, and the house seemed to shiver with each gust. Eliza's breath fogged up the cold glass of the window as she peered outside, straining to see through the torrents of rain. She saw something moving in the distance, an indistinct figure darting among the trees. Her heart skipped a beat. Who could be out there in this weather? Panic set in as she realized she couldn't remember the last time Jack had called or checked in. Eliza tried to call him from the landline, but the phone line was dead. She was alone, with no way to reach anyone. As the storm raged on, Eliza heard a soft, rhythmic tapping coming from the front door. She hesitated, the tapping becoming more insistent. She shone her lantern toward the door, but the flickering light barely cut through the darkness. She approached the door cautiously and peered through the peephole. The figure she saw was not just any stranger. It was a man, drenched and wild-eyed, his face smeared with mud and rain. He pounded on the door, his voice barely audible over the storm. "Please, let me in. I need help." Eliza's heart raced. She didn't want to open the door, but she couldn't ignore someone who might be in real trouble. She carefully unlatched the door and opened it a crack. "Who are you? What happened?" The man's face was etched with terror. "My car broke down. I saw your lights and came for help. Please." Eliza was about to let him in when she noticed something strange. The man seemed familiar. His eyes, his build. Before she could react, another lightning flash illuminated his face fully. It was Jack, but older, dirtier, and looking as if he had been out in the storm for days. "Jack?" she gasped, her voice trembling. "What's going on?" Before Jack could answer, the storm outside seemed to intensify, and the wind howled louder, almost like a living entity. The power surged back on suddenly, and the lights flickered to life. Eliza's relief was short-lived. She turned to see that Jack was not standing there anymore. Only the wind was howling against the now-closed door. Eliza spun around, the room now illuminated by the lights. Her phone was still missing, but she found her own face reflected in the large mirror above the fireplace. Her reflection looked back at her with eyes wide in terror. As she stepped closer to the mirror, she saw something behind her, an indistinct shadow moving slowly across the wall. She whipped around, but there was nothing there. The shadows seemed to dance and shift with each flash of lightning. She felt a cold breath on her neck and spun around to find the house empty once more. The only sound was the unrelenting storm and her own racing heartbeat. She decided to check the house, her flashlight beam cutting through the darkness as she made her way from room to room. In the attic, she found a dusty old chest she had never seen before. The lid was slightly ajar, and Eliza's curiosity got the better of her. She opened it slowly, revealing old photographs and letters. One of the photographs showed a man who looked exactly like Jack, but from an era long before the present. The dates on the letters were from decades ago. Eliza's blood ran cold. The letters spoke of a man who had disappeared in a storm, presumed dead. The final letter was dated the day before, written by someone who had seen Jack's face in a storm, a face that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Suddenly, the attic door slammed shut, and Eliza was plunged into darkness. She fumbled for her flashlight, the beam flickering wildly. She heard the unmistakable sound of someone or something moving around her. The shadows in the attic seemed to come alive, swirling and whispering. Eliza stumbled toward the door, her breathing ragged. As she reached for the handle, a cold hand gripped her shoulder. She spun around to find Jack standing there, but his face was now a ghastly visage, hollow and eyes devoid of life. "You should have never let me in," he said, his voice echoing like a distant memory. "I'm not who you think I am." Eliza's scream was swallowed by the storm as she felt herself being pulled into the darkness. The attic door burst open, and she was thrown out into the living room, the lights flickering once more. The storm outside began to wane, but as Eliza looked around, she saw that the house had changed. The furniture was different. The wall title, The Shadow's Warning. The night was unusually dark, the moon hidden behind thick, oppressive clouds. The storm that had been brewing all day finally erupted, sending torrents of rain cascading from the heavens. The wind howled through the trees like a chorus of mournful spirits. Emily huddled in her small, isolated cabin on the edge of the moor, her fingers wrapped tightly around a cup of hot cocoa. She had always found solace in the solitude of her retreat, but tonight something felt different. The wind seemed to be whispering, carrying a strange, guttural voice that Emily couldn't quite make out. She tried to shake off the unease, attributing it to the storm's wild nature. But the whispers grew louder, more insistent, making her skin crawl. She tried to focus on the book in her hands, but her gaze kept drifting to the windows, where the rain pounded relentlessly. Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out. Emily's heart skipped a beat. The only light now came from the sporadic flashes of lightning. She grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and turned it on, casting a beam of light around the dim room. The shadows seemed to dance on the walls, growing larger and more menacing with each flicker of lightning. A loud, rhythmic thudding noise came from outside. Emily froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was like footsteps pounding heavily on the ground, getting closer with each thunderclap. She edged toward the window, trying to peer through the thick rain. The flashes of lightning revealed nothing but the storm's relentless fury. Deciding to check the front door, Emily moved cautiously, the flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. As she reached the door, the thudding stopped abruptly. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. Her instincts screamed at her to stay inside, but curiosity got the better of her. She slowly opened the door, the wind nearly yanking it from her grip. The front porch was empty, soaked with rain. She stepped out cautiously, shining her flashlight around. The storm roared louder, and the rain pelted her relentlessly. She scanned the area, but saw nothing unusual. Just as she was about to turn back inside, a shadow moved in the corner of her vision. She spun around, but there was nothing there. Emily closed the door, her mind racing. She returned to the living room, her thoughts a jumbled mess. She glanced at the clock. Midnight. The storm was supposed to pass by now, but it seemed to grow stronger. The wind's whispers were now a full-fledged wail, and the house felt like it was being squeezed by the storm. The noise returned, more urgent this time. Emily followed the sound, which led her to the old, dusty attic door. The attic had been unused for years, filled with forgotten relics and memories. The thudding was coming from above, growing louder and more frantic. Her heart pounded as she climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. As she reached the top, the thudding stopped. The attic was eerily quiet, save for the sound of the storm raging outside. She shined her flashlight around, illuminating old trunks, dusty furniture, and cobwebs. Her light fell upon an old mirror covered with a sheet. She moved toward it, her breath fogging up the glass. Just as she was about to pull the sheet off, she heard a low, guttural growl behind her. She spun around, but there was nothing. The attic was empty, yet the air felt charged with an unseen presence. She shone the flashlight around again, and that's when she saw it, a shadow moving against the wall, morphing and shifting as if alive. Emily's heart raced as she approached the mirror. She removed the sheet slowly, revealing a reflection that wasn't her own. The figure in the mirror was a gaunt, hollow-eyed apparition, staring back with an expression of pure despair. The storm outside seemed to intensify with each beat of Emily's heart. The apparition's mouth moved, but no sound came out. Emily could read its lips. Run. A chill ran down her spine. She turned to leave the attic, but the door slammed shut with a deafening bang. The shadows in the attic grew darker and more oppressive, swirling around her like a living fog. The thudding sound resumed, now accompanied by muffled whispers. Emily pounded on the door, desperation taking hold. "Let me out!" she cried, her voice cracking with fear. The thudding grew louder, more insistent, and then silence. Suddenly, a deafening crash came from the ceiling, and a portion of the attic floor gave way. Emily stumbled back, nearly falling into the gaping hole. As she steadied herself, a figure appeared in the darkness, a spectral woman, her face twisted in sorrow and rage. Emily's eyes widened in terror as the apparition's voice filled the attic. "You should have listened. The storm will take what it's owed." The woman's ghostly form moved closer, her eyes locking onto Emily's. The room spun around her, and the shadows seemed to close in. Emily felt herself being pulled toward the hole in the floor, her feet slipping on the debris. In a burst of adrenaline, Emily grabbed a nearby beam and pulled herself away from the edge. She ran for the attic door, pounding on it with all her strength. The door finally gave way, and she stumbled down the stairs, the storm's fury almost knocking her off her feet. She ran back to the living room and, without looking back, dashed out of the house into the rain. She sprinted across the moor, the storm's wrath now a mere background roar to her frenzied escape. The wind seemed to be pushing her forward, guiding her away from the cursed cabin. When she reached the edge of the moor, she turned to look back at the cabin. It was illuminated by a final blinding flash of lightning. The house was gone, swallowed by the storm as if it had never existed. All that remained was a swirling vortex of wind and rain, where the cabin had once stood. Emily never returned to that place, and the storm eventually passed, leaving nothing but a memory of a night that defied reality. The whispers of the wind continued to tell the tale of the shadow's warning, echoing through the moor, a reminder of a storm that had taken more than just its share. Title: The Watcher's Lament. The night began quietly enough. Anna had always enjoyed the peace of her remote farmhouse, tucked away in the dense woods that surrounded it. Tonight, however, the usual tranquility was interrupted by a brewing thunderstorm. The sky grew dark and heavy, and the wind began to stir with an unsettling energy. The first distant rumble of thunder rolled through the trees, and Anna decided to settle in for the night, seeking comfort in a cozy armchair by the fireplace. The power went out just as she was about to light a candle. The house plunged into darkness, the only light coming from occasional flashes of lightning that pierced the stormy sky. Anna grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and made her way back to the living room. She pulled a blanket over her and settled into her chair, trying to ignore the mounting sense of unease that just stuffed up her spine. The storm seemed to grow fiercer by the minute. The wind howled like a living entity, and the rain pounded against the windows with relentless force. Anna's only solace was the crackling fire, casting flickering shadows on the walls. The power flickered back on briefly, illuminating the room with a stark, artificial light before plunging it into darkness again. This time, the thunder was closer, and the house seemed to vibrate with each crack of lightning. Then, Anna heard something that sent a shiver down her spine, a faint, rhythmic tapping coming from the front door. At first, she tried to ignore it, but the tapping persisted, growing louder and more urgent with each passing minute. Anna's heart pounded as she grabbed the flashlight and moved cautiously toward the door. The storm outside was now a cacophony of howling wind, torrential rain, and thunder that seemed to shake the very foundation of the house. The tapping continued, relentless and insistent. She peered through the peephole but saw nothing but darkness and rain. Hesitant but driven by a mix of fear and curiosity, she slowly opened the door, the wind threatening to slam it shut. The porch was empty. The rain lashed against her face, and she squinted into the storm. The tapping had stopped, but as she turned to go back inside, she saw a figure standing at the edge of the property, partially obscured by the heavy rain and darkness. The figure was tall and cloaked, the hood pulled low over its face. Anna felt a chill as the figure began to slowly approach. She slammed the door shut and locked it, her breath coming in quick, shallow bursts. The figure was now directly outside her window, its shape barely visible through the rain. Anna's mind raced. Who could be out there in this storm? What did they want? She moved to the window and tried to peer through, but the storm made it impossible to see clearly. The figure remained a dark silhouette, its presence almost suffocating. The lightning flashed again, briefly illuminating the figure's face. Anna gasped as she recognized the pallid, drawn features of a man she had never seen before. His eyes were hollow and haunted, and he seemed to be staring directly at her. She backed away from the window, her heart hammering in her chest. The figure's appearance was unsettling, but what truly terrified her was the sense of familiarity, like she had seen him in a dream or a forgotten memory. The storm's fury seemed to intensify as if reacting to her fear. The tapping returned, this time on the side of the house. Anna turned and saw the figure's shadow moving across the wall. Panic set in, and she raced to the back door, checking to make sure it was securely locked. As she did, she heard a loud crash coming from the attic. The attic door, which had been securely shut, was now ajar. Anna hesitated, her mind racing with dread. The storm's roar was deafening, and the thudding from above was growing louder. She grabbed a flashlight and slowly climbed the creaky stairs to the attic, her steps echoing in the oppressive silence. The attic was dark and musty, filled with old trunks and forgotten belongings. As she moved the flashlight beam around, she noticed an old mirror propped up against the wall. Scared, partially covered by a dusty sheet. The thudding noise seemed to come from behind the mirror. With trembling hands, Anna pulled the sheet off the mirror. The reflection that met her eyes was not her own, but the face of the man she had seen outside. His eyes were wide with anguish, and his mouth moved silently as if trying to speak. Before she could react, the storm outside reached a deafening crescendo. The attic door slammed shut, trapping her inside. The figure in the mirror seemed to come to life, its expression one of desperation and warning. Suddenly, the storm's fury shifted. The wind howled in a frantic, almost sentient way, and the lightning flashes revealed glimpses of something moving through the house. Dark, shifting shadows that seemed to merge with the storm. Anna felt a cold, clammy hand grip her shoulder. She spun around to find herself face to face with the apparition, its eyes filled with an unbearable sorrow. The figure's mouth moved again, and this time Anna could hear its faint, echoing voice. "Help me. I need to go home." The air grew colder, and the shadows in the attic seemed to pulse with an otherworldly energy. The figure's ghostly form reached out, and Anna was pulled into a swirling vortex of darkness. The storm's rage reached a climax, and then, as abruptly as it had begun, everything went silent. Anna awoke the next morning, the storm now a distant memory. The sun was shining, and the once dreary house was bathed in warm light. The attic door was open, and the mirror was gone, leaving only an empty space. The figure was nowhere to be seen. As she stepped outside, she noticed something odd. Her garden, which had been wild and unkempt, was now perfectly manicured, the flowers blooming in neat rows. The storm had left no trace, and everything seemed unnervingly calm. The only reminder of the night's events was a small, weathered photograph lying on the ground near the porch. In it, she saw the figure, the man she had seen in the storm. He was smiling, surrounded by a family in a garden that looked eerily similar to her own. Written on the back of the photograph was a single sentence: "Thank you for setting me free." Anna felt a shiver run down her spine as she realized that the storm had been more than just a natural event. It had been a bridge between worlds, and she had unknowingly been part of a tragic tale that had finally come to its end. Title: The Storm Whisperer. The storm was an uninvited guest, arriving with a fury that rattled the small, isolated cabin nestled deep in the woods. The rain beat down in relentless torrents, and the wind howled with a chilling intensity that seemed to shake the very trees. Inside, Michael sat alone at the dining table, his fingers drumming nervously on the wood. He had come to the cabin for solitude, to escape the chaos of the city and clear his mind. But tonight, the storm seemed to bring more than just a change in weather. The power had gone out hours ago, leaving Michael with nothing but the soft glow of a lantern and the eerie silence punctuated by the storm's rage. The cabin, with its creaky floors and drafty windows, felt increasingly claustrophobic. Michael tried to focus on a book, but the constant noise outside made it nearly impossible to concentrate. As the night wore on, Michael noticed a peculiar sound, a faint, rhythmic tapping that seemed to come from outside the cabin. At first, he tried to ignore it, thinking it was merely the wind playing tricks, but the tapping grew louder, more insistent. It was as if someone, or something, was trying to get in. With a sense of growing unease, Michael grabbed a flashlight and headed toward the front door. The tapping stopped the moment he approached. He hesitated, listening to the storm's roar and the silence that followed. With a deep breath, he opened the door just enough to peer outside. The rain poured down in sheets, obscuring his view. There was no one there. He closed the door, locking it firmly. The tapping resumed, this time on the side of the cabin. Michael's nerves were frayed, and he decided to investigate. He moved cautiously around the cabin, shining his flashlight through the windows. The storm outside seemed to intensify, and the wind screamed through the trees. The tapping continued, now accompanied by a low, mournful wail that seemed to rise and fall with the wind. Michael's flashlight beam landed on an old, gnarled tree near the cabin. Its branches swayed and twisted like skeletal fingers. The tapping seemed to come from within the tree, as if something were trapped inside. Suddenly, the lantern flickered and went out, plunging Michael into darkness. He fumbled for the flashlight, his heart racing. The tapping grew louder, and the wail became a desperate cry. Michael shone the flashlight toward the tree, and for a brief moment he saw something, a shadowy figure clinging to the trunk, its face obscured by darkness. Fear surged through him, but curiosity drove him to approach the tree. The wind howled louder, and the shadows seemed to swirl around the figure. Michael reached out, his hand trembling. The figure's voice came through clearly now, a soft, plaintive whisper, "Help me." As he reached the tree, the figure began to take shape. It was a woman, her face pale and eyes wide with a mixture of fear and sadness. She reached out to him, her fingers barely brushing the flashlight's beam. "Please," she said. "You have to help me. I can't get out." Michael took a step back, his mind racing. He knew this was no ordinary storm. The woman's voice had a haunting quality, and the sight of her was unnerving. But he couldn't ignore the plea for help. He glanced around, searching for something to aid her. The wind howled louder, and the storm seemed to reach its peak. Michael noticed a rusted shovel lying nearby and grabbed it, digging furiously at the base of the tree. The ground was soggy and difficult to work with, but he kept digging, driven by the woman's desperate cries. As he dug, the woman's form became clearer. Her eyes were filled with a deep, sorrowful longing. She reached out again, her voice a whisper now. "Please, you must hurry. I need to be free." Michael dug deeper, the rain soaking through his clothes, and finally struck something solid. He cleared the dirt to reveal an old wooden box. The box was weathered and covered in strange symbols. The woman's face twisted in anguish as she saw it. Michael opened the box, revealing a collection of old letters and a tattered photograph. The photograph showed a group of people, family members, with one woman standing apart, her face similar to the ghostly figures. The letters spoke of a tragic story, a woman who had been trapped in the woods by a storm long ago, her spirit bound to the earth by a curse. The final letter was a plea for release, written by the woman in the photograph. It spoke of a ritual that needed to be performed to free her spirit from the storm's grip. Michael realized that the storm was a manifestation of the woman's torment, and that by releasing the contents of the box, he might be able to break the curse. The woman's figure began to fade, her voice growing fainter. "Please," she whispered one last time, "finish it." Michael read through the letter, finding instructions for the ritual. He followed them as best he could, using items from around the cabin, a candle, a piece of string, and some salt. He performed the ritual as the storm continued to rage around him. As he completed the final step, the storm began to abate. The wind died down and the rain lessened to a gentle drizzle. The figure of the woman grew fainter until she finally disappeared with a serene smile on her face. Exhausted and drenched, Michael looked around. The cabin was still and quiet, the storm now a distant memory. The sky was beginning to clear, revealing the first light of dawn. He looked at the photograph and letters, knowing they would serve as a reminder of the night's events. Michael packed up the items and left the cabin, his heart heavy but relieved. As he drove away, he glanced back at the now calm woods. The storm had passed, but its echoes would remain with him forever. A haunting reminder of the night he had helped free a lost soul from the storm's eternal grip, titled The Echoes in the Thunder. The town of Ravenbrook was no stranger to storms. Nestled in a deep valley, it had always been a place where rain fell heavier, lightning struck closer, and thunder boomed louder. But this storm was different. The air was thick with anticipation, the sky an eerie shade of green, and the wind swirled as if whispering secrets to the trees. Catherine sat in her car, hands gripping the steering wheel, and with her as she navigated the winding roads leading to her childhood home. It had been years since she'd returned, years since she'd left without a backward glance, desperate to escape the small town's suffocating grasp. But tonight the storm had drawn her back almost against her will. A strange compulsion had filled her after a call from her younger sister, Lucy, with only a single desperate phrase: "Come home. Tonight." The storm intensified as Catherine approached the old, Victorian-style house which stood on the hill like a sentinel overlooking the valley below. Lightning illuminated its weathered facade, casting long shadows across the lawn. The rain was so heavy it was as if the heavens were trying to wash the town away. Catherine parked and rushed inside, where Lucy was waiting, her face pale and eyes wide with fear. "Thank God you're here," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the roar of the storm. "What's going on?" Catherine demanded, shivering from the cold rain. "Why did you want me to come back?" Lucy glanced nervously toward the window, her hands wringing the edge of her sweater. "It's the storm," she said. "And the whispers. You'll hear them soon." Catherine frowned, confused and a little unnerved. "Whispers? What are you talking about?" Before Lucy could respond, a deafening crash of thunder shook the house, rattling the windows. For a moment the power flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the walls. Catherine could swear she heard a faint, indistinct murmur in the background, almost like a hushed conversation just out of earshot. Lucy grabbed her hand. "Do you hear it?" Catherine strained her ears. There it was again, a low, almost inaudible whisper, carried on the wind. She couldn't make out the words, but it felt wrong. The sound seemed to wrap around her, making the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. What is that?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Lucy swallowed hard. "It's them, Catherine. They come with the storm." Before Catherine could ask who they were, the whispering grew louder, almost urgent, as if pleading with her. The sound seemed to fill the room, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. The words were indistinct, but the tone was unmistakable. Desperate, frantic, afraid. Lucy led Catherine to the old family room, where a fire had been lit to ward off the cold. "It started last month during another storm," she explained. "At first, it was just a faint noise, but every time it storms, the voices get louder. I think they're trying to tell us something." Catherine shivered, not from the cold, but from the sheer wrongness of it all. "This is crazy, Lucy. It's just the wind, the storm." But even as she spoke, the whispers grew louder still, more distinct. She could make out snatches of phrases: "Find us, remember, help." The words seemed to echo in her mind, growing more insistent with each passing second. Catherine's head throbbed, and she grabbed her temples. "Why are they so loud? What do they want?" Lucy looked at her with a strange, almost haunted expression. "I think they're lost, Catherine. I think they're trapped." "Trapped? Where?" Catherine asked, but even as the question left her mouth, she knew the answer. She felt it deep in her bones, an old, buried memory surfacing. She turned to Lucy, her voice barely a whisper. "The old well." Lucy nodded, fear in her eyes. "Yes, I've been hearing them from there every time it rains." The well. Of course. The old abandoned well on the edge of their property, covered for decades. They had played there as children, daring each other to go close, to listen to the echoes within. Catherine's heart began to race as another wave of memories washed over her, memories she had long since tried to forget. The storm outside reached a fever pitch, the wind howling like a wounded animal. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices now, all pleading and desperate. Catherine knew they had no choice. They had to go to the well. Grabbing flashlights and coats, the sisters stepped out into the raging storm. The rain lashed against their faces, and the wind threatened to push them back. But they pushed forward toward the back of the property where the old well stood. When they reached it, Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The well was almost invisible under a thick growth of vines and moss. But the whispers were loudest here, almost deafening. They seemed to emanate from the very ground, vibrating with an energy that made Catherine's skin crawl. "We need to open it," Lucy shouted over the roar of the storm. Catherine hesitated. She could feel the cold emanating from the well, a chilling force that seemed to reach deep into her bones. But the whispers were growing more desperate, more insistent. She grabbed an old, rusty shovel and began prying at the cover. With a loud creak, the wooden cover finally came free, revealing a yawning black hole that seemed to swallow all light. The voices surged, a deafening chorus of pain and longing. Catherine shone her flashlight down into the well, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. "Do you see anything?" Lucy asked, her voice trembling. Catherine squinted, leaning closer. At first, there was nothing, just endless black. But then she saw them, faces, dozens of them, pale and spectral, eyes wide with fear. They were reaching up, their mouths moving in silent screams, their hands clawing at the sides of the well. Catherine stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. "There are people down there." Lucy grabbed her arm. "They're not people, not anymore. They're the ones lost in the storms over the years, and they want out." Catherine felt her heart hammering in her chest. She had heard stories growing up, stories of people who had disappeared during the storms, never to be seen again. They were just tales, old legends, or so she had thought. "What do we do?" Catherine whispered. Before Lucy could answer, a powerful gust of wind knocked them both to the ground. The flashlight slipped from Catherine's hand and tumbled into the well, its light vanishing into the darkness. For a moment, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, in the sudden quiet, Catherine heard a voice, a single, clear voice, unlike the others. It was soft, gentle, familiar. "Catherine?" She froze, recognizing the voice immediately. It was their mother's voice, who had disappeared in a storm years ago, never found. Her heart clenched with a mix of fear and hope. "Mom?" The voice spoke again, faint but certain. "Help me. Come find me." Tears filled Catherine's eyes. "How? How do I help you?" Suddenly the storm seemed to shift, the wind dying down slightly. The voices quieted, all except for her mother's. "Remember," it whispered. "Remember the path you took." Catherine's mind raced, and then she remembered a hidden path through the woods that they had often taken as children, a path that led somewhere deeper beyond the well, a path that seemed forgotten by time. "The path!" she exclaimed to Lucy. "We need to go down the old path in the woods." Lucy nodded, and they turned away from the well, running back into the storm, guided by memory and hope. As they plunged into the trees, Catherine swore she could hear her mother's voice clearer than ever, guiding them, leading them toward something or somewhere. The storm began to abate, and as they continued, they saw it, a faint glow in the distance. Catherine's heart pounded as they moved closer. The glow grew brighter, and suddenly they broke through the trees into a clearing. There, standing in the soft golden light, was their mother, smiling, her form ethereal but unmistakably real. "You found me," she whispered. Catherine felt a rush of relief and joy, tears streaming down her face. "Mom!" But as they approached, the glow began to fade, and with it, their mother's form. "Thank you," she whispered, "for listening to the storm." And just like that, she was gone, leaving only the echo of her voice in the fading rain. The storm finally passed, the sky clearing, revealing a bright, starry night. The whispers were gone, but the memory of that night would stay with Catherine and Lucy forever, a reminder that sometimes, even in the darkest of storms, the lost can find their way home. The storm had been brewing for hours, a heavy, oppressive tension hanging in the air. It was the kind of night that seemed to hold its breath, waiting for something to happen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, dark clouds gathered like an army, ready to wage war on the quiet, sleepy town of Mill Creek. Julie sat alone in her grandmother's old farmhouse, nestled deep within the woods. The house was miles from the nearest neighbor, isolated by dense trees and a winding dirt road that seemed to disappear into the night. It was a place Julie had loved as a child, a sanctuary of summer memories and fireflies. But tonight, it felt different. The house was old, its wooden frame creaking with the weight of decades. The wind whispered through the gaps in the windows, carrying with it a chill that made the hair on the back of her neck stand on end. She had come to the farmhouse to escape the chaos of the city, seeking solitude and a break from the relentless pace of her life. But as the storm rolled in, Julie began to question the wisdom of her decision. The weather report had predicted heavy rain and thunder, but nothing had prepared her for the ferocity of the storm now descending upon the forest. The first flash of lightning lit up the sky, casting eerie shadows across the room. Julie flinched as the thunder followed, a deep, guttural rumble that shook the very foundations of the house. The lights flickered and then went out, plunging the house into darkness. Her heart raced as she fumbled for her phone, the only source of light now that the power had failed. She found the flashlight app and turned it on, the narrow beam cutting through the darkness. The house seemed even more unfamiliar now, every shadow stretching and twisting in the dim light. Julie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. It was just a storm, she reminded herself. There was nothing to fear. But then she heard it, a faint, almost imperceptible sound beneath the howling wind and pounding rain. It was coming from the front porch, a soft, rhythmic creaking. Julie froze, the beam of her flashlight trembling slightly as she pointed it toward the front door. The creaking continued, growing louder with each swing of the porch swing, except she hadn't touched that swing since she arrived. Her breath caught in her throat as she stepped closer to the door, her mind racing through a dozen explanations. Maybe it was the wind, she thought, though she knew it was unlikely. The swing had been rusted and stiff, nearly impossible to move without significant force. She peered through the peephole, but it was useless. The storm had enveloped the world in darkness, and the small circle of glass revealed nothing but blackness. Gathering her courage, she reached for the doorknob, hesitating for just a moment before twisting it open. The door swung open with a groan, and Julie shone her flashlight onto the porch. The swing was moving, gently swaying back and forth, but what made her blood run cold was the figure sitting on it. It was a man, drenched from head to toe, his clothes clinging to his gaunt frame. His head was bowed, his face obscured by a mop of wet hair. He didn't react to the light, didn't even seem to notice her standing there, staring in shock. Julie's mind raced. Who could he be? Why was he here? The nearest house was miles away, and no one had any reason to be wandering through these woods in the middle of a storm. "Hello?" Julie called out, her voice trembling despite her efforts to sound firm. The man didn't respond. He just sat there, the swing creaking beneath him. Julie's heart pounded in her chest as she stepped closer, the beam of her flashlight trembling as it illuminated his face. And then he looked up. His eyes were hollow, empty sockets where there should have been pupils. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were drawn into a ghastly, unnatural smile. Julie stumbled back, a scream rising in her throat as she slammed the door shut. Her hands shook as she locked it, backing away from the door as if the flimsy wood could protect her from whatever was out there. She could still hear the swing, creaking steadily in the storm, and the faint sound of footsteps on the porch. Her mind raced. She had to get out of here, had to escape whatever nightmare she had stumbled into. Julie grabbed her keys and made a dash for the back door, flinging it open just as another bolt of lightning split the sky. She froze. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was the man. He was closer now, his smile wider, his hollow eyes fixed on her. Julie's breath caught in her throat as she slammed the door shut, her mind spinning in terror. How had he gotten there? How was it possible? She ran to the phone, but the line was dead. Her cell had no signal, and the storm raged on outside, trapping her in this isolated house with no way to call for help. Panic set in as she realized she was truly alone. The creaking of the swing was now a relentless rhythm, punctuated by the deafening crashes of thunder. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing the largest knife she could find, her only means of defense. Her thoughts were wild, torn between staying hidden and making a run for it. Suddenly, the noise stopped. The swing, the footsteps, even the wind seemed to hold its breath. Silence pressed in on all sides, suffocating her with its weight. Julie waited, every nerve in her body on edge, praying for the storm to end. And then came the knock. It was soft, almost polite, as if the visitor from the porch was now requesting to be let in. Julie felt her knees weaken, her grip on the knife tightening as she backed away from the door. The knock came again, more insistent this time. She couldn't take it anymore. With a burst of desperate courage, she ran to the front door and yanked it open, ready to confront the horror face to face. But the porch was empty. The swing was still. The forest beyond it dark and silent. No sign of the man, no footprints in the mud, nothing. Julie's breath came in ragged gasps as she stared out into the storm, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had she imagined it all? Was it some trick of the mind, brought on by the storm and her isolation? But as she stepped back inside, closing the door behind her, she noticed something that made her blood cold. The floor was wet. Soaking wet, as if someone had been standing there, dripping rainwater onto the wooden planks. Julie's heart raced as she followed the trail, which led to the hallway, and stopped right in front of the mirror. She gasped, dropping the knife as she stared at her reflection. The face staring back at her wasn't her own. It was his, and he was smiling. The haunting of Holloway Road. The old Holloway Road had a reputation. It was a stretch of pavement that twisted and turned through a dense forest, a road forgotten by most, save for those who lived in the small, dwindling town of Ashgrove. The locals knew better than to travel it after dark, for there were stories, whispers of things that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the unsuspecting. Laura had heard the stories growing up, but she had never believed them. She was a practical person, one who dismissed ghost tales and urban legends as nothing more than fanciful nonsense. But life in the city had worn her down, and when she inherited her grandmother's old house in Ashgrove, she decided it was time for a change. She moved into the house with her daughter Emily, eager to start anew. The house sat at the end of Holloway Road, a lonely, creaking structure that had seen better days. But Laura didn't mind. She loved the quiet, the solitude, and the sense of history that came with living in a place that had been in her family for generations. Emily, however, was less enthusiastic. She was only 8 and missed the bustling life of the city, the friends, the parks, the noise. "It's too quiet here, Mom," Emily would often say, her big brown eyes wide with unease. "It feels like the trees are watching." Laura would laugh and reassure her that it was just the wind in the leaves, that there was nothing to be afraid of. But as the days turned into weeks, even Laura began to feel a creeping sense of unease. The house had its quirks, strange noises at night, doors that wouldn't stay shut, cold spots that appeared in the middle of the summer, but she chalked it up to the house's age. Then came the thunderstorms. They were unlike anything Laura had ever experienced. They rolled in quickly, dark clouds swallowing the sky, and the wind would howl like a living thing. The rain would pound against the roof, so loud that it drowned out all other sounds. The lightning was blinding, and the thunder so powerful that it shook the house to its foundations. On the first night of the storm, Laura woke to a loud bang. She sat up in bed, her heart pounding, convinced that a tree had fallen on the house. But everything seemed intact. She listened for a moment, but all she could hear was the rain hammering against the windows. Then she heard the footsteps. They were soft at first, a faint creaking of the floorboards in the hallway outside her room. Laura frowned, thinking it was Emily, but when she went to check, her daughter was fast asleep in her bed. The footsteps continued, moving slowly through the house as if someone or something was walking the halls, searching for something. "Mom, there's someone outside." Emily whispered the next morning, her voice trembling. Laura's heart sank. What do you mean? I saw him through my window, Emily said, her eyes wide with fear. A man. He was just standing there, looking at the house. Laura felt a chill run down her spine. She tried to dismiss it, telling herself that Emily had probably just seen a shadow or imagined it. But the look in her daughter's eyes told her otherwise. That night, Laura made sure all the doors were locked, the windows shut tight, and the curtains drawn. But the storm returned, more violent than before, and with it came the footsteps. This time, they were louder, more insistent, as if whatever was in the house was growing bolder. Laura lay in bed, her heart racing, clutching covers to her chin as the footsteps moved from room to room, coming closer and closer. She forced herself to get up and investigate, her hands shaking as she gripped the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but empty hallways and darkened rooms. But the footsteps continued, always just out of sight, just out of reach. The next day, Laura decided she needed to know more about the house and the road it sat on. She visited the town's library and began digging through old records, newspapers, anything that might explain the strange occurrences. What she found left her cold. Holloway Road had a dark history. Decades ago, a man named Thomas Holloway had lived there, a recluse who had built the road and several houses along it, including Laura's. He was a strange man known for his obsession with the occult and the supernatural. The townsfolk whispered that he had made a pact with something not of this world. But it was what happened after his death that terrified Laura the most. Thomas Holloway had disappeared one stormy night, never to be seen again. Some said he had been taken by whatever dark forces he had summoned. Others believed he had been murdered. But one thing was certain. After his disappearance, people began to avoid the road. Strange things started happening. Sightings of a man walking along the road during thunderstorms, houses becoming haunted, and worst of all, children going missing. Laura's blood ran cold as she realized the implications. The man Emily had seen, the footsteps in the house, was it Thomas Holloway? Was he still searching for something or someone? That night, the storm returned with a vengeance. Laura put Emily to bed, but she couldn't sleep. She sat in the living room, clutching a candle as the power flickered on and off, her nerves on edge. The wind howled outside, and the rain pounded against the windows, but it was the footsteps that she listened for, the soft creak of floorboards that signaled the presence of something unseen. Then, as the clock struck midnight, the footsteps began again. This time, they were different, faster, more purposeful. Laura's breath caught in her throat as she realized they were heading straight for Emily's room. Without thinking, she grabbed the flashlight and ran down the hallway, her heart pounding in her chest. She threw open the door to Emily's room, but it was too late. Emily was standing by the window, her small face pale and frightened. Outside, in the pouring rain, stood the figure of a man, his eyes glowing in the darkness. He was looking directly at Emily, his mouth moving as if whispering something only she could hear. "Emily!" Laura screamed, running to her daughter and pulling her away from the window. But as she did, the man outside lifted his hand, pointing directly at her. The window shattered, glass exploding inward as a deafening crack of thunder shook the house. When Laura looked again, the man was gone. But Emily was different. She was silent, her eyes vacant, as if something had taken hold of her. No matter what Laura did, she couldn't get her daughter to respond, as if Emily was no longer there. In the weeks that followed, the storms continued, but Emily remained in her eerie silence. The doctors could find nothing wrong, but Laura knew better. Something had taken her daughter, something from that cursed road, and it wasn't going to let go. One night, as another storm raged outside, Laura heard the footsteps again. But this time, they weren't just in the house. They were in Emily's room. She rushed to her daughter, only to find the bed empty, the window wide open, the curtains billowing in the wind. Laura ran to the window, screaming Emily's name, but all she saw was the dark, twisting road, illuminated by the flicker of lightning. And in the distance, a small figure was walking away, hand in hand with a shadowy figure, disappearing into the storm. No one in Ashgrove ever saw Emily or Laura again. The house on Holloway Road was left to decay, its windows boarded up, its doors sealed shut. But on stormy nights, when the thunder roars and the wind howls, some say you can still hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the empty halls, searching for something that was lost long ago. The Keeper of Ashcroft Manor. The Ashcroft Manor stood at the edge of town, a grand old mansion that had once been the pride of the Ashcroft family. But those days were long gone. Now, the manor was a dilapidated relic, its once magnificent gardens overrun with weeds, its windows cracked and dusty, and its halls empty and cold. The townspeople of Graysville spoke of it in hushed tones, warning their children never to go near it. But the stories that surrounded the manor were not just tales of ghosts or curses. They were tales of something far more sinister. When Claire inherited Ashcroft Manor from her estranged uncle, she saw it as a chance to start over. She had recently gone through a bitter divorce and was looking for a place to escape, to rebuild her life. The manor, despite its decaying state, seemed like the perfect opportunity. She could fix it up, restore it to its former glory, and maybe even find some peace in the process. Claire arrived at the manor on a bright autumn afternoon, the golden leaves crunching underfoot as she made her way to the front door. The house loomed before her, its shadow stretching long across the ground. As she unlocked the door and stepped inside, a wave of cold air washed over her. The interior was dark and musty, the air thick with the scent of age and neglect. The first few days passed uneventfully as Claire began the daunting task of cleaning and repairing the house. She worked from morning until night, trying to bring some life back into the decaying mansion. But as she delved deeper into the house, exploring its many rooms and hidden corners, she began to notice strange things. It started with the mirrors. Every mirror in the house, no matter how old or new, seemed to have a strange quality about it. They were all slightly warped, reflecting her image back at her in ways that made her uneasy. Sometimes she thought she saw movement in the reflection, just a flicker, a shadow darting behind her, but when she turned around, there was nothing there. One night, as a fierce thunderstorm raged outside, Claire decided to explore the attic. She'd been putting it off, dreading what she might find in the dusty, forgotten space. But something compelled her to go, a nagging feeling that there was something up there she needed to see. The stairs creaked ominously as she climbed, the narrow beam of her flashlight cutting through the thick darkness. The attic was vast, filled with old furniture, trunks, and covered paintings. Dust motes danced in the air as she moved, the floorboards groaning under her weight. As she made her way deeper into the attic, she noticed something strange, a large, full-length mirror standing in the center of the room, completely uncovered. It was out of place among the forgotten relics, its glass pristine and free of dust. Claire approached it cautiously, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something about the mirror that made her skin crawl, something that felt wrong. She stood before it, her reflection staring back at her. But as she gazed into the glass, she noticed something odd. Her reflection wasn't quite right. It was her, but there was a delay in its movements, a slight lag, as if the reflection was trying to keep up with her. Claire raised her hand, and the reflection followed, but a heartbeat too late. A cold shiver ran down her spine as she took a step back. The reflection did the same, but then it stopped. The reflection's face twisted into a grotesque smile, its eyes darkening, and it reached out toward her from the other side of the glass. Claire stumbled back, her heart racing, and the mirror suddenly shattered, shards of glass flying in every direction. Panting and terrified, Claire ran back downstairs, slamming the attic door behind her. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight, persisted. She couldn't shake the sensation that she was no longer alone in the house. That night, as the storm raged on, Claire awoke to the sound of footsteps outside her bedroom door. She lay still, her breath caught in her throat, listening as the footsteps moved slowly down the hallway, stopping right outside her door. The doorknob rattled, as if someone or something was trying to get in. Summoning all her courage, Claire grabbed the small hammer she had been using earlier for repairs and crept to the door. She pressed her ear against the wood, listening. The house was silent except for the pounding rain and the occasional rumble of thunder. Suddenly there was a loud bang from downstairs, followed by the sound of glass shattering. Claire jumped back, her heart racing. Something was in the house. She had to get out. Gripping the hammer tightly, she flung the door open and raced down the stairs, her footsteps echoing through the empty halls. She reached the bottom of the stairs and froze. There, standing in the middle of the foyer, was a figure. It was a man, tall and gaunt, dressed in old-fashioned clothing that seemed out of place in the modern world. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes, cold and empty, locked onto hers. "You shouldn't be here," the man said, his voice a low, eerie whisper that seemed to reverberate through the walls. "This place is mine." Claire's heart pounded in her chest as she backed away, her mind racing. Who was this man? How had he gotten in? And why did he look so wrong? "Get out of my house," she screamed, brandishing the hammer. The man's lips curled into a cruel smile. "This is not your house, Claire. It has never been yours. You are nothing but a visitor here, and it is time for you to leave." Suddenly, the air around her grew cold, the temperature dropping so rapidly that her breath became visible in the air. The lights flickered and went out, plunging the house into darkness. Claire's heart raced as she stumbled backward, trying to find her way to the front door. But as she turned, she found herself face to face with the man once again, though she had not heard him move. "You will not escape," he whispered, his voice echoing in her mind. "This house is mine, and so are you." With a scream, Claire turned and ran. She raced through the house, trying every door, every window, but they were all locked, sealed tight as if by some unseen force. The man's footsteps echoed behind her, growing closer and closer, no matter how fast she ran. Finally, she reached the basement door. It was the only place left to go. She threw it open and ran down the steps, the darkness closing in around her. The basement was cold and damp, the walls lined with shelves of old jars and rusted tools. She could hear the man's footsteps above her, slow and deliberate, as if he knew she had nowhere left to hide. In the far corner of the basement, Claire spotted a door, a small, heavy door that looked like it hadn't been opened in decades. She ran to it, yanking it open with all her strength. Beyond the door was a narrow, pitch-black tunnel, its walls lined with stone. Without thinking, she plunged into the darkness, the door slamming shut behind her. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, the air growing colder and more oppressive with each step. Claire's breath came in ragged gasps as she ran, her heart pounding in her chest. The darkness was absolute, swallowing her completely, and the only sound was the echo of her own footsteps. Finally, she saw a faint light ahead, a small, flickering glow that beckoned her forward. She stumbled toward it, desperate for any sign of escape. But as she neared the light, she realized with horror that it was not an exit, not a way out. It was a mirror, the same mirror she had seen in the attic, standing at the end of the tunnel. And in the mirror, she saw herself, older, haggard, with the same cold, empty eyes as the man who had pursued her. Her reflection smiled at her, a twisted, mocking grin that sent chills down her spine. "You can never leave, Claire," the reflection whispered. "You are part of this house now. You are its keeper." Claire screamed, turning to flee, but the tunnel was gone. The walls had closed in around her, trapping her in the small, dark space with the mirror and her twisted reflection. The cold seeped into her bones, the darkness closing in, suffocating her. In the town of Graysville, the people spoke of Ashcroft Manor as a place of mystery, where time seemed to stand still, and those who entered were never quite the same when they left, if they ever left at all. The manor remained empty, abandoned, its doors forever shut. But on stormy nights, when the wind howled and the rain poured down, some claimed they could see a light flickering in the windows, and if you listened closely, you might hear the faint sound of footsteps echoing through the halls. No one dared go near, for they knew that Ashcroft Manor had found a new keeper, and she was waiting for anyone foolish enough to enter her domain. The Spectre of Willow Creek Bridge. The small town of Willow Creek was known for its tranquility. Nestled deep within the rolling hills and dense woods of the Pacific Northwest, it was the kind of place where everyone knew each other, where secrets were whispered rather than shouted, and where the past had a way of lingering like the morning mist. The heart of the town was the old stone bridge that crossed over Willow Creek, a narrow, winding river that gave the town its name. The bridge had stood for over a century, its weathered stones bearing the marks of time and countless footsteps. But the bridge also had a darker side, one that was rarely spoken of except in hushed tones and with wary glances. The legend of Willow Creek Bridge was one of those stories that everyone in town knew, but no one liked to talk about. It was said that on stormy nights, when the wind howled through the trees and the rain lashed down like a fury, the ghost of a woman appeared on the bridge. She was known as the Spectre of Willow Creek, and those who saw her never came back the same, if they came back at all. Rebecca had grown up hearing the stories, but like many, she dismissed them as nothing more than local folklore. She was a rational person, a science teacher at the local high school, and she didn't believe in ghosts or curses. So when her car broke down late one night near the bridge, she wasn't afraid, just annoyed. The storm had rolled in quickly, dark clouds swirling above as the wind picked up, shaking the trees and rattling the old wooden signposts along the road. Rebecca cursed under her breath as she pulled her coat tighter around her, stepping out into the cold rain to check under the hood of her car. The engine was dead, and her cell phone had no signal, not surprising in such a remote area. "Just my luck," she muttered, slamming the hood shut and looking around. The only thing nearby was the bridge, its stone arches barely visible through the sheets of rain. She knew there was a small gas station about a mile down the road, but the thought of walking there in the storm didn't appeal to her. Still, she didn't have much choice. Pulling her hood up, Rebecca started walking. The rain pelted her face, the wind whipping her hair into her eyes. As she approached the bridge, she noticed something odd, a figure standing in the middle, barely visible through the downpour. For a moment, she hesitated. Who else would be out here in this weather? "Hey," Rebecca called out, her voice nearly drowned by the wind. "Do you need help?" The figure didn't move. It just stood there, motionless, as if waiting for something. Rebecca squinted, trying to get a better look, but the rain made it difficult to see. She took a few cautious steps forward, her heart pounding a little faster. As she drew closer, she could make out more details. The figure was a woman, dressed in what looked like an old-fashioned white dress, the fabric clinging to her as the rain soaked through. Her hair was long and dark, hanging wetly around her face, and her head was bowed as if she were staring down at the ground. "Are you okay?" Rebecca asked, her voice wavering slightly. The woman slowly lifted her head and Rebecca's breath caught in her throat. The woman's face was pale, too pale, almost translucent, and her eyes were dark, hollow voids that seemed to bore into Rebecca's soul. There was something profoundly unsettling about those eyes, something that made every instinct in Rebecca's body scream to run. But she couldn't move. She was frozen in place, her feet rooted to the wet stones of the bridge as the woman took a slow step toward her. "You shouldn't be here," the woman said, her voice low and eerie, like the whisper of the wind through the trees. Rebecca's heart raced, her mind struggling to make sense of what she was seeing. This had to be a prank, she told herself, some elaborate joke to scare tourists or newcomers. But deep down, she knew this was no prank. There was something terribly wrong with this woman, something otherworldly. I was just passing through," Rebecca stammered, her voice trembling. "My car broke down." The woman took another step forward, her expression unreadable. "No one passes through, not on a night like this." Rebecca took a step back, the cold stone of the bridge pressing against her as she realized she had nowhere to go. The woman was now only a few feet away, her dark eyes locked onto Rebecca's. "What do you want?" Rebecca whispered, her fear rising with every heartbeat. The woman tilted her head slightly as if considering the question. Then, in a voice that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, she said, "I want to go home, but I can't, not until someone takes my place." Rebecca's blood ran cold. The stories, the warnings, everything she had dismissed as nonsense came flooding back to her. The specter of Willow Creek wasn't just a ghost, she was a curse, a restless spirit trapped on the bridge, doomed to remain there until someone else took her place. And now that someone was Rebecca. "No," Rebecca whispered, shaking her head. "No, I won't. I won't do it." The woman's expression didn't change, but her eyes seemed to darken, the shadows within them growing deeper, more menacing. "You have no choice." Rebecca's body moved on its own, her feet dragging her forward as if pulled by an invisible force. She struggled against it, her mind screaming in protest, but it was no use. The woman reached out, her cold, ghostly hand touching Rebecca's arm, and an icy chill shot through her body, freezing her in place. "Please," Rebecca gasped, her breath coming in ragged bursts. "Please, don't do this." The woman leaned in closer, her voice a whisper in Rebecca's ear. "You will stay here, as I have stayed. You will wait, as I have waited. And one day someone will come to take your place." With that, the woman released her, and Rebecca collapsed to the ground, the rain soaking through her clothes as she struggled to breathe. But when she looked up, the woman was gone. The bridge was empty, the storm still raging around her. Rebecca tried to stand, but her legs wouldn't obey. A crushing sense of dread settled over her as she realized what had happened. She was bound to the bridge now, just as the specter had been. She was the new keeper, the forgotten forest. Nestled in the quiet countryside of Vermont was a place known as Wicker's Hollow. It was a dense, sprawling forest that had earned its reputation as a place of both beauty and dread. The trees were ancient, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, and the air was thick with the scent of moss and damp earth. Few dared to venture into the hollow, especially after dark. For as long as anyone could remember, Wicker's Hollow had been shrouded in mystery, and the stories told by the locals only added to its eerie allure. The most infamous of these stories was that of the whispering trees. It was said that anyone who entered the hollow would hear voices, a cacophony of whispers that seemed to come from the very trees themselves. These whispers were rumored to be the voices of those who had entered the forest and never returned, their souls trapped within the twisted wood, eternally lost. Jenna and her friends had heard the stories, of course, but they were skeptical. They were college students, home for the summer, and looking for a thrill to break up the monotony of their small-town lives. So when Jenna suggested a camping trip in Wicker's Hollow, her friends were all too eager to accept the challenge. "We'll prove everyone wrong," Jenna had said confidently as they packed their gear into the back of her Jeep. "It's just a bunch of old legends. Nothing to worry about." The four of them, Jenna, Mark, Lisa, and David, set out on a warm July afternoon, the sun high in the sky and their spirits even higher. The drive to the hollow took them down winding roads through rolling hills and past weathered barns that had seen better days. As they neared the forest, the trees seemed to close in around them, their thick canopy blocking out the sun and casting long shadows across the road. They arrived at the edge of Wicker's Hollow just as the sun began to dip below the horizon, its last rays filtering through the trees in a golden haze. The entrance to the forest was marked by an old, weather-beaten sign that read, "Wicker's Hollow, enter at your own risk." "Creepy," Lisa muttered as they unloaded the car. "But it's kind of exciting, too." "Don't worry," Mark said, slinging his backpack over his shoulder. "We'll be out by morning, and we'll have a great story to tell." The group set off into the forest, following a narrow, overgrown trail that wound its way deeper into the hollow. The deeper they went, the quieter it became. The sounds of birds and insects faded away, replaced by an eerie silence that made the hairs on the back of Jenna's neck stand on end. They found a small clearing just as darkness fell, and quickly set up camp. A fire was lit, and soon they were laughing and joking as they roasted marshmallows and shared ghost stories. But as the night wore on, an unsettling feeling began to creep over them. The shadows around the campfire seemed to grow longer, darker, as if the trees were closing in. "I'm going to get more firewood," Jenna said, standing up and grabbing a flashlight. "I'll come with you," David offered, but Jenna shook her head. "I'll be fine. It's just a few steps away." Jenna walked a short distance from the camp, the beam of her flashlight cutting through the darkness. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of leaves under her boots. As she bent down to pick up a fallen branch, she heard it, a faint whisper, barely audible but unmistakable. "Jenna." She froze, her heart skipping a beat. The voice was soft, almost gentle, but there was something deeply unsettling about it. She looked around, but there was no one there. Just the trees, their branches swaying slightly in the breeze. "Jenna, come closer." The voice was more insistent now, coming from deeper within the forest. Jenna's rational mind told her to turn around, to go back to the safety of the campfire. But something else, a strange, almost hypnotic pull, urged her to follow the voice. "Hello?" she called out, taking a few hesitant steps forward. "Is someone there?" There was no response, just the whisper of her name carried on the wind. Jenna's feet moved on their own, taking her farther from the camp, deeper into the hollow. The trees seemed to close in around her, their twisted branches forming a canopy that blocked out the moonlight. "Jenna?" The voice was right in front of her now, coming from an ancient oak tree that stood taller and wider than the others. Its bark was rough, its branches heavy with leaves, and its roots twisted out of the ground like the gnarled fingers of a giant. There was something strange about the tree, something that made Jenna's skin crawl, but she couldn't look away. "Jenna?" The voice was coming from the tree. It was impossible, but she could hear it, clear as day, whispering her name. Her heart pounded in her chest as she reached out, her hand trembling, to touch the bark. As soon as her fingers made contact, a shock ran through her body, and the world around her seemed to shift. The trees swayed violently, the ground beneath her feet felt like it was moving, and the whispers grew louder, more urgent. "Jenna! Jenna, help us!" She stumbled back, her head spinning, as the whispers became a chorus of voices, overlapping and echoing in her mind. They were desperate, pleading, and full of pain. "We're trapped. Jenna, save us!" She tried to run, but her legs wouldn't obey. The roots of the tree had wrapped around her ankles, holding her in place. Panic surged through her as she struggled, but the more she fought, the tighter the roots became, pulling her closer to the tree. "No! Let me go!" Jenna screamed, but the voices only grew louder. Suddenly, the bark of the tree began to shift and move, revealing faces, twisted, contorted faces of men, women, and children, their eyes wide with fear and their mouths open in silent screams. Jenna's breath caught in her throat as she realized what she was seeing. The souls of those who had entered the hollow and never returned, trapped within the tree, their voices now part of the whispers that haunted the forest. Before she could react, the ground beneath her opened up and she was swallowed by darkness. The last thing she heard was the sound of her friends calling her name, growing fainter and fainter as she was pulled deeper into the earth, until there was nothing but silence. Back at the camp, Mark, Lisa, and David sat around the dying fire, waiting for Jenna to return. Minutes turned into hours, and the uneasy feeling in the pit of their stomachs grew stronger with each passing moment. "Maybe we should go look for her," David suggested, glancing nervously at the dark forest around them. "Yeah," Mark agreed, standing up. "She's been gone too long." They grabbed their flashlights and set off into the woods, calling Jenna's name, but there was no answer. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the wind and the distant echo of their own voices. As they neared the old oak tree, the same one Jenna had encountered, they stopped. There was something wrong, something deeply, inexplicably wrong. The air was thick with an oppressive energy, and the whispers began, faint at first, but growing louder with each step they took. "Jenna." The voice was unmistakable. It was Jenna's voice, but it was distorted, twisted, as if it were coming from far away, or from deep within the earth. "Jenna, where are you?" Lisa called out, her voice trembling. "Help me!" The voice was closer now, almost as if it were coming from the tree itself. They shone their flashlights on the bark, and their blood ran cold. There, among the twisted roots and gnarled branches, was Jenna's face, her eyes wide with terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. They stumbled back, horror-stricken, as the realization set in. Jenna was gone, trapped within the tree, just like the others who had come before her. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if the forest itself was alive, watching them, waiting. "We have to get out of here," Mark shouted, grabbing Lisa's arm. "Now!" But it was too late. The roots of the tree burst from the ground, wrapping around their legs and pulling them down. They struggled, screamed, but the forest was relentless, dragging them into the earth, their voices joining the chorus of whispers that haunted Wicker's Hollow. Days later, when a search party was sent to find the missing students, they found no trace of them, only their abandoned campsite and the old oak tree, its bark smooth and silent, as if nothing had ever happened. The people of Willow Creek added 4 more names to the list of those lost to the hollow, and the legend of the Whispering Trees grew. To this day, no one dares enter Wicker's Hollow after dark, for fear of hearing the whispers and becoming part of the forest's twisted secret. And on stormy nights, when the wind howls through the trees, some say you can still hear the voices of those who were lost, calling out for help that will never come.